of Zimbabwe through the ratification of the ILO Convention 182 on the worst forms of elimination of the worst forms of child labor, and other conventions like Convention 138, which talks about the minimum age. So we want to just say we are happy to be here as an organization, and we look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Labour and Social Welfare, Government of Zimbabwe and representatives, development partners and United Nations representatives present, Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, Zimbabwe Federation of Trade Unions, Employers Confederation of Zimbabwe, Tobacco Industry Marketing Board, civil society, company and private representatives, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I believe all protocols are observed. It is with absolute pleasure that I'm here today on my first visit to Zimbabwe. It is also my pleasure to take part in today's critical and timely multi-stakeholder discussions on child labour in tobacco agriculture in Zimbabwe. On behalf of the Eliminating Child Labour in Tobacco Growing Foundation, or ECLT as you will hear us say, I welcome the opportunity to be able to contribute to this important dialogue and to join the key national stakeholders represented here today to help identify and to facilitate the driving up of standards of child welfare in tobacco growing areas. But today is not about problems. More importantly, it's about coming together for solutions. Solutions are needed to ultimately reduce levels of child labour in the very communities we have come here today to discuss. ECLT is proud to be an emerging partner with the Government of Zimbabwe in this key endeavour. As you may already be aware, the ECLT Foundation is an independent Swiss foundation based in Geneva with oversight from the Government of Switzerland. And we act as a global leader in preventing child labour in tobacco agriculture. We're currently operating and engaged in 10 states. And our work is about protecting and improving the lives of children wherever tobacco is grown. So for over 17 years, we have been committed to addressing the root causes of child labour, which have impacted in our time more than 650,000 children and families in over 10 countries where tobacco is grown. And we are also very pleased that the ILO acts as our key technical advisor. Much has been achieved, but much work still remains. And we all know that child labour in tobacco agriculture is a complex issue, and one which should not just be reserved for being addressed by the tobacco industry, but one which intimately touches on surrounding and complementary crops that are being grown by the very same communities on the very same farmland and tended by the very same growers, all of whom are attempting to make a legitimate living and a better life for the next generation. As we will hear today throughout today's discussions and dialogue, there is much ground to be covered collectively in this fight. But as I look around the room today, we are very well positioned to create new blueprints for designing good practices and indeed achieving the desired impact that we all want to see. As the ECLT Foundation, we pride ourselves on supporting collective and collaborative collegiate approaches to addressing root causes of child labour in the countries in which we operate around the world. So as I say, with 17 years experience and a dedicated team from 6 countries speaking 11 languages with numerous development sector disciplines, our foundation is able to independently and objectively stand alongside you to ensure that we work efficiently and effectively and have genuine impact on behalf of the lives of Zimbabwean children in tobacco growing communities. And finally, we look forward to the forthcoming engagement and indeed assisting the Government of Zimbabwe to develop sustainable actions which will go some way to addressing root causes of child labour and to progressively eliminate this issue. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Amondi. Can I now call upon Mrs. Felani Masukume to give us remarks on behalf of Labour. Thank you. Let's give him a hand.
Good morning once again. ZF2 remarks on child labor dialogue. The Minister of Labor and Social Welfare, Honorable P. Kagonye, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Labor, Mr. N. Masoka, Ministry officials here present, all the stakeholders here present, ladies and gentlemen. ZF2 would like to implore the government of Zimbabwe through the Ministry of Labor on their willingness and a commitment to address the issue of child labor in the tobacco sector, following reports by the Human Rights Watch. Tobacco is said to be one of the major foreign currency earners for the country, thereby contributing to the economic growth. However, such economic growth should not come in the expense of labor rights and the safety and health violations. In fact, the economic growth so desired should improve the livelihood of the citizenry through improvement in the Human Development Index. The message we are sending is that in as much as Zimbabwe is open for business, labor rights, health and safety should not be compromised at all. ZF2 would like to call upon Zimbabwe Occupational Safety and Health Council under NASA to embark the medical surveillance of the employees in the tobacco sector for adverse health effects, and so subsequently determine the effectiveness of exposure prevention strategies. As trade unions, we commit to continuous conscientization programs to the employees on their labor and OSH rights. To our employers in the tobacco sector, we appeal to you to give back to the community by investing towards addressing the issues which were raised, that is basic education, health and safety in the sector, so as to complement the efforts being made by the government in ensuring access to basic education to children such as BIM or OSH through NASA. We also encourage employers in the sector to embrace the OSH culture to adhere to their fair labor practice. We hope that our collective deliberations and efforts from all the stakeholders present today will go a long way in addressing issues raised, and that the intervention mechanism will eventually come out with also be cascaded to all the other sectors where child labor is also rampant. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masokume. As a Minister of Labor, we always cherish our tripartite structure whenever we speak.
I am not really surprised. You were a little reluctant to give me a hand. I represent the employer, and the employer is not the most loved of constituents in society. However, to make things easier for you, I've always said I am not an employer myself. Well, okay, I do employ, or my wife employs a domestic worker. I am the worker of the employers. So we have a lot in common, you and I. I work, you work. Therefore, we start from a very basic understanding of each other. For that, ladies and gentlemen, you can now give me a clap. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we meet here because we are talking of child labor in tobacco. And there are no two subjects that can be more important to Zimbabwe than this. We know as background that our children work because we are poor. in a survey done by MCOS in 2001 in conjunction with the ILO and Ethical Trading Initiative, we did find that of children who were working in tobacco, 96% of them were doing that because they could do no other thing. There was nothing else for them to do. Now, this was not a full-scale 100% sample, because we just sampled children in tobacco growing regions. But I think it tells the story. 96% of them were working because there was really nothing else for them to do. Now, this is a national problem which calls for a national solution. And I am very happy that in the new dispensation, we have set ourselves the target of becoming a middle-income country by 2030, which means there will then definitely be no need for any child to work. So that is something that makes me very hopeful and very eager. We come back to the present and we look at the importance of tobacco in our economy. We are complaining that we do not have as much money in our banks now as we would really like to have. But I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that when the tobacco selling season ends, things are going to get a lot worse for us than they are now. Right now, we are enjoying a lot of income from the tobacco that we are selling. And thank God, we are hoping to sell more than 200 million kgs of tobacco this year, the best we have done since the turn of the century. All this money is coming back into the economy and turning our wheels. And when this thing stops, as it will around August, then you will find that we are not really generating as much foreign currency as we should have. Therefore, it is our duty, all of us, to make sure that we really look after this important foreign currency earner that we have in the form of tobacco. I hear the worker when he says there is no excuse for bad labor practices just because you are working in a good industry. I couldn't agree more. We should not have instances where there are bad labor practices. But let us also understand, ladies and gentlemen, that sometimes it is not bad for children to work under supervision. I think even the ILO has got a term for this. They call it child work. I can tell you from a personal example that before I joined MCOS, I was with the tea estates in the eastern part of Zimbabwe. We had a way of working there which we called a task system. The worker had to pluck X number of kgs for them to complete their task. And we even went a step further and we subdivided our fields into little plots so that each worker had a plot. Now, you needed to either pluck X number of kgs or complete your plot for you to be said to have earned a day's wage. And what would happen is you get the children having gone to school, they come back from school, and they come and join their parents in ensuring that the little plot is plugged. They are working under the direct supervision of the parent. They have already been to school, and in situations like this, I don't know whether you could call this child labor. What we would like to see is a similar kind of thing happening in the tobacco sector as well, where children are helping out, because we do need that help, but they are helping out in controlled circumstances, preferably under the direct supervision of the parent. And there is absolutely no question that children should not be exposed to harmful chemicals. In fact, not even adults should be exposed to harmful chemicals. So I would really like to thank ECLT Foundation, because this is what we are here to do. We are here to make sure that we grow as much tobacco as we possibly can in the safest environment that we possibly can. I hardly ever speak without taking a gentle dig at the government, and this would be the exception if I didn't. My very good father-in-law, here it comes. We need more information on what is happening in the labor sector. The last labor sector survey we had was in 2014, and we really should have these maybe on an annual basis, most on a biannual basis, so that we can at least see whether we are making progress, remaining still, or regretting. I am sure that we are I want to believe from what the employers in tobacco tell me that we are making progress. And Mr. Chassis there will bear witness to this. Thank you. But we need it independently verified, and the verification would be in the labor force market surveys. So ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very happy that at least in this meeting, we are all on the same side. We are all fighting for the same thing, and that one thing is, as I've said before, number one, to grow as much tobacco as we can, because we need the foreign currency. Because we want to look at SDG goal number 8, where we are moving our people out of poverty, because we need the foreign currency. And number 2, we want to do this as safely as possible. Thank you very much indeed.
The Employers Confederation of Zimbabwe, Mr. John Mfukare, the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, Mr. Japhet Moyo, or his representative, the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Federation of Trade Unions, Mr. Kenyas Shamuyarira, or his representative, the Director of the ILO Country Office for Harare, in fact it's for Zimbabwe and Namibia, Ms. Hoplong Pororo, represented here by Mrs. Chimedza, the Director of the Elimination of Child Labor in Tobacco Foundation, Mr. David Hammond, Executive Director of the National Economic Consultative Forum, Mr. Norman Chakanetsa, or his representative, representatives from the United Nations agencies here present, representatives of the non-governmental organizations, government officials here present, worker and employer representatives here present, esteemed representatives of the tobacco sector, invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. It gives me great pleasure to address you today as we gather for a multi-stakeholder meeting on child labor in the tobacco sector. I am indeed delighted by the good attendance, which shows the commitment and the interest that we have as various stakeholders to address the issue of child labor. Allow me, Director of Ceremony, from the onset to express government's gratitude for this opportunity to bring together a vast gathering of stakeholders to discuss child labor issues. The convening of this important meeting signifies our collective commitment as government, social partners, United Nations agencies, non-governmental organizations, and indeed players in the tobacco industry to fulfill our moral obligation to effectively deal with the child labor in general and its worst forms in particular. Director of Ceremony, I wish to point out that Zimbabwe is committed at the highest level to working towards the elimination of child labor. As a country, we have ratified all key international and regional instruments which relate to the welfare and the rights of children, such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989, the International Labour Organization, ILO, many instruments, that is the Minimum Age Convention of 1995, that is Convention number 138, and the worst forms of child labor, that is of 1999, Convention number 182. At the continental level, Zimbabwe ratified the African Charter on the Rights and the Welfare of Children in 1995. Furthermore, at the sub-regional level, Zimbabwe adopted the Southern African Development Community SADC Code on child labor and has been submitting periodic reports to these institutions. In terms of national legislation, our national constitution has provisions in section 81 that advance the rights of children and they protect them from economic exploitation, including child labor. 2 acts of parliament that are administered by the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare, which give further protection of children, are the Children's Act, that is Chapter 506, and the Labor Act, Chapter 2801. These acts have undergone progressive review to align them to the various provisions of the ratified international conventions and indeed our national constitution. It is important for me to highlight that the Labour Act, Chapter 2801, has progressively increased the minimum age for admission into employment from 15 years to 16 years, which is in line with the age at which most students complete their ordinary level education. In addition, this is also the age at which one can undertake apprenticeship courses in accordance with the Manpower Development Act. With those legislative provisions in place, Director of Ceremony, the government of Zimbabwe has committed itself to taking urgent steps to progressively reduce the incidences of child labor. The Department of Labor Administration has labor inspectors who enforce labor laws by checking compliance through random checks in their inspectorate function. This is designed to deal with cases where worker rights are violated, which includes checking for incidents of child labor. In addition to child labor inspections, government has also put in place various programs to protect children from economic exploitation and ensure that they remain in school. These deliberate interventions take into account the fact that the proper and the responsible upbringing of children is a direct contribution to the development of the country. Having outlined the legislative measures that we have put in place, allow me to talk briefly about the administrative measures that we have put in place. Since 1999, government has carried out some child labor surveys to ascertain the existence as well as nature and the extent of child labor in Zimbabwe. Studies have been carried out in 1999, in 2004, and in 2008, and most recently, in 2014. It has been observed that child labor does exist across many sectors, including the agricultural sector. However, with a specific reference to tobacco farms, there has not been any dedicated study which has shown the evidence of the phenomenon. Therefore, the prevalence of child labor in tobacco farms cannot be determined with certainty. Notwithstanding this, government has taken deliberate efforts to address the child labor issue in a holistic manner. From the studies that government has undertaken, it has been noted that the root cause of child labor is poverty. Resultantly, children are forced out of school. Furthermore, the prevalence of the HIV and AIDS pandemic in recent years has resulted in the emergence of child-headed households. In addressing these challenges, the following interventions have been put in place. 1. National Action Plan for Orphans and Vulnerable Children program, which is a community-based child protection program that uses a multi-sectoral approach in supporting the protection of children. And 2, food deficit mitigation program and drought management. In drought situations, children are often forced into selling labor to get food for themselves and their families. To avoid that, the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare implements the food deficit mitigation program, whose key objective is to mitigate the impact of drought among both labor and non-labor constrained households, whereas building community livelihoods. 3, harmonized social cash transfer program, whose objective is to provide social cash transfers to vulnerable households in Zimbabwe, and to complement social cash transfers with other social protection initiatives that include child protection and access to basic social services. The harmonized social cash transfer as a social protection intervention is a predictable, consistent, and a sustainable way of addressing chronic household poverty arising out of aging, chronic illness, and the burden of care for the elderly, orphans, and the sick. It aims at increasing incomes for those households without labor capability and are food poor, particularly providing support for the care and the protection of children, most of whom are orphans and vulnerable children. 4, public assistance. This is a monthly maintenance allowance program for vulnerable people and households in districts where the harmonized social cash transfer is yet to commence. Number 5, health assistance. The government pays for health fees to institutions for general and specialized health services for vulnerable people through the assisted medical treatment order. Number 6, Basic Education Assistant Module, BEAM program. The program is a social protection intervention which was established by the government in 2002 as a community-based social safety net system to ensure access to education for vulnerable children. The primary objective of the BEAM program is to reduce the number of children dropping out of school and reach out to children who have never been in school due to economic hardships through the payment of levies, tuition, and examination fees, as well as boarding fees for children with special needs enrolled in registered special schools. BEAM provides fee waivers for eligible primary and secondary school children for tuition, examination fees, and applicable levies. Director of Ceremony, having outlined the above and taking the global strategies of child labor into consideration, it is important for us to make concerted effort towards the elimination of child labor in all its forms, in all key sectors of the economy. Last year, in 2017, the ILO noted that child labor is overwhelmingly concentrated in agriculture and that the numbers are increasing. It was estimated that 152 million children were engaged in child labor, of which 71% were working in agriculture, including fishing, forestry, animal husbandry, and aquaculture. Much of this work was reported to be hazardous work, which by its nature or circumstances is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. Truly, these global statistics are alarming and point to the fact that child labor is a sad reality that needs our urgent and immediate action at a global level, and more importantly, at the national level. Accordingly, I believe that it is high time that the elimination of child labor be taken as a cross-cutting issue that should be mainstreamed in social and economic development policies and programs. We must realize that child labor not only limits the development potential of the children and their families, but also limits future growth potential of the country's economy. The opportunity cost of the underdeveloped potential of children who are victims of child labor can never be recovered or mitigated in any way. In other words, the incidence of child labor is true, but sad reflection of lost future opportunities for the country. Director of Ceremony, the government of Zimbabwe is therefore fully dedicated and committed to the discussion here today, whose overall objective is to facilitate dialogue around child labor issues in the tobacco industry. This discussion is of utmost importance as it gives direction to the course of action that we all must take. I say this being mindful of the fact that there is a lack of statistical data on the nature and the prevalence of child labor in the tobacco industry. It is therefore necessary for us to find modalities of how we can gain an insight into the tobacco industry, particularly as it relates to its operations, and if at all children are engaged in any economic activities. It is through surveys that we can gain the necessary information to inform policy formulation. Director of Ceremony, as I draw to a close of my remarks, I wish to reiterate government's commitment towards the elimination of child labor in all its forms and across all key economic sectors. From our experience in conducting surveys, we have learned that success in the elimination of child labor lies in collaborative efforts wherein government will provide the necessary regulatory framework, ensure implementation of policies, and partner with the relevant stakeholders for an all-encompassing approach. Each of us around the table has an important role to play, including the communities from which we come. Let us redouble our efforts towards the total elimination of child labor. In the same vein, I wish to call upon National Employment Council to diligently pursue their mandate of inspecting workplaces. I wish to implore you to strengthen your capacities by training your designated agents, as well as to consider increasing labor inspectors, director of ceremonies, as a show of our continued desire to working towards elimination of child labor. I wish to also inform the House that Zimbabwe has offered to host the 5th Global Conference on Child Labor, which is expected to be held in 2021. At that time, it is our hope and expectation that we will have covered significant ground in order to showcase our success story in the fight against child labor. With this in mind, I wish to call upon you all to apply your minds in today's discussion on how best we can tackle the problem of child labor. Director of Ceremony, I wish to end here. It is therefore my singular honor to declare this multi-stakeholder meeting officially open. I thank you.